This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Sex toys are far from a modern invention. In fact, humans have been making them for millennia. In today's show, we're going to explore the very long and very fascinating history of sex toys. For example, we'll introduce you to the oldest dildo ever discovered. We'll also talk about how dildos have changed and evolved, going from Stone Age carvings to high-tech instruments of pleasure. In addition, we'll talk about the true story behind the invention of the vibrator. And it's probably not the story that you've heard before. Spoiler alert, the first electric vibrator was actually made for men, not women. We'll also discuss the fascinating history of the cock ring and the history of contraception. I am joined by Esme Louise James, who is best known for her Kinky History podcast and social media series, which has amassed nearly 3 million followers. Esme is a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, and her thesis traces an aesthetic of the erotic across 18th century literature. Esme is author of the new book, Kinky History, a rollicking journey through our sexual past, present, and future. This is going to be another amazing conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become Sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become Sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Hi, Esme, and welcome back to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
So excited to be back. Thanks for having me back on again.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have you back to talk about even more kinky history. Let's talk about the fascinating history of sex toys, starting with the dildo. Now, we actually pulled some old dildos out of the Kinsey Institute archives to show how these are not modern inventions by any stretch of the imagination. So what can you tell us about how long people have been making and using these toys? And do we know what the earliest recorded dildo is on record?
We absolutely do. I think this has to be one of my favorite facts of all time because every time I say it, it just continues to blow my mind. The oldest known dildo that we have to date is 28,000 years, which is truly an astonishing fact when you put into perspective other inventions like the invention of writing, which is only 5,000 years ago, right? And while this model was found in this German cave and dated to 28,000 years ago, we also have models from all over the world that are 10,000 years old, 15,000 years old, 11,000 years old, all that have very similar designs. They're generally stone objects, phallic in shape. A few have rings etched around the top. And in the research paper from the archaeologists who found this one from 28,000 years ago, they described it as being highly polished at the top from overuse, which is to date my favorite line I've ever read in a research paper.
Can you imagine how exciting it would be to be on an archaeological dig and you uncover some ancient sex toys?
I think my favorite part about the discovery as well was that it was found in 14 different fragments, and they put together the first 13 fragments and they were just missing one. And until they found that last piece, they didn't dare say what it was. And so I kind of love this like sense of anxiety for a little bit, being like, we won't declare it as a dildo just yet. And then they have that like last little shard. They're like, now it's a dildo.
Love that. So we've had dildos long before we had books and television and other things like that. These have been part of our history, our kinky history, for a long time. Now, of course, the dildos of the past were nothing like the dildos of today, aside from their shape, of course. And they were made of materials that you might not be as excited about putting inside of your body, right? It wasn't until the 1960s that the dildos were revolutionized and mass produced. So what can you tell us about the story behind that? Who was Gosnell Duncan and how did he forever change the dildo?
Gosnell Duncan is one of the most influential people, I think, in the history of sex toys in the modern times, but also such a forgotten history. And it was Dr. Hallie Lieberman who finally kind of told Gosnell Duncan's story. So Gosnell Duncan, it's in the 1960s. He sustains an injury at work that leaves him a paraplegic. And while he's discovering how to live again, one of the things that he realizes is that sex is just not part of the conversation in his rehabilitation. And while they had, sex toy alternatives, none of these were body safe. They were made from material that couldn't withstand vigorous washing and high temperatures. And if you know anything about the sanitization of sex toys, these are really important factors. So Gosnell Duncan kind of takes it upon himself to invent the first silicone dildo, which is really the kind of go-to design that we still use today. So he patented this design. And really it's a turning point in sex toys in general, because while he was producing a product that was meant to make sex more accessible to the disabled community, this design also catches on and it brings dildos to the mainstream in a lot of ways, because we finally have a product that is body safe, which is kind of mind-blowing as well when we think about dildos being 28,000 years old, that we're only looking at body safe models in the 1960s. And you can really see that there was this kind of sense of it not being considered important enough to people's sexualities that there needed to be a sense of design in the modern age, which I think is where the conversation is starting to change a lot.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating story that I don't think anybody really knows. And I think, when you look at something like a dildo, you just kind of take it for granted and assume somebody just, created a phallic shape and that was it. But these toys have a long and interesting history behind them. And I think in the case of the dildo, it's really fascinating that someone with a disability created this modern version of the toy, and it was really designed more for that purpose, as opposed to today, how dildos are often used, marketed, and sold. It's sort of like more of a masturbatory or pleasure aid or supplement or addition to sex. So yeah, there's this interesting story that we just often don't realize when it comes to sex toys and other things in our sexual history.
Absolutely. And I think it opens up this conversation about this kind of, I suppose, Venn diagram between a sex toy and a sex aid. And when we're looking at these products as well, we're looking at the way that they can aid sexuality and the way that they can enhance pleasure. And some of the times, the two of them go together. And I think when we are looking at the connection that these toys have had in making pleasure accessible as well, you can really start to understand the validity of these products in our everyday world as well, for those who are quite scared to and maybe critical of them.
Yeah, so many applications and purposes with a lot of these toys. So let's take a little dildo detour here and talk about the Ulysses dildo created by Masters and Johnson. So this was a device that they invented in the 1960s to assist them in their studies of sexual response in the lab. So what was this high-tech dildo that they created, and do we know why they called it the Ulysses?
I probably should start to have a list of my favorite dildos of all time, starting with the 28,000-year-old dildo and potentially coming to the Ulysses dildo of Masters and Johnston's studies. So Ulysses, of course, is the figure of the Odyssey, the Cyclops giant, this giant figure that has one eye that, we have all the way back from ancient fables. Now, when Masters and Johnsons are conducting their research, really kind of bringing the study of sex to a scientific field in some potentially questionable ways, one of the things that they were interested about was the female orgasm and how this worked and functioned, which really hadn't been done on this kind of level of scientific study at this stage. So what they invented was an intervaginal photography device, i.e. a dildo that had a camera installed inside of it so that they could study what was happening inside of a woman when she orgasmed. Potentially where their biggest faux pas came was that they then showed this footage at a conference with the rest of their academic peers, which I believe got them barred for quite some time, not only from this conference, but also a bit of a loss of funding for the rest of their projects. But of course, that didn't stop Masters and Johnson, who then took it upon themselves when they could no longer pay for participants just to have sex with one another and continue their studies that way. Truly wonderful figures.
So interesting. Yeah, I've talked about the device before that they've created when I've taught about human sexuality in lectures. I didn't actually know that it was called the Ulysses, though, and that's an interesting little side piece. And now I'm actually wondering if we have that in our collection at the Kinsey Institute, because I know that the Masters and Johnson archives were donated there. So I'm going to have to go back and check and see if we might have the Ulysses somewhere.
I would give a lot in my life just to see the Ulysses. I have this picture in my head of what it could have looked like. How comfortable was it that it was giving so many people an orgasm in this very clinical environment? I'm fascinated by Ulysses. Truly a wonderful dildo.
I'm fascinated by Masters and Johnson's research in general, just the fact that they got so many hundreds of people to come into their lab to have sex literally in front of scientists so that they could understand what is happening in the human body and develop this whole model of sexual response. And to think that it took place in the 1960s in St. Louis, Missouri, it's just, kind of a very unlikely confluence of factors. And I think that's true in the case of a lot of the history of sex research, is that it's often taken place in parts of the country, parts of the world that you wouldn't necessarily expect for that to happen. Just like in the case of Alfred Kinsey's research being conducted in Indiana, which is a pretty historically conservative state. Yeah, it's just unlikely places where a lot of this sex research happens.
I think it just speaks to this desire to talk about sex, though, right? Quite recently, I traveled to Dublin and I was doing a few talks there. And it was really fascinating. One of the nights that we ran was this kink education night, where we had a collection of sex educators, dominatrixes come in and, do workshops. And I was there giving some history of a dildo, which is what you want when you're learning about spanking. But one thing that was really interesting was that there was this conversation that kept on coming up from people who came to these workshops, talking about the fact that their upbringing had been very, very conservative when it came to talking about sex. And this has kind of led in the last 10 years to this explosion of conversations about sex in Dublin. These events that are run monthly always sell out. And I just, I think about living in Melbourne. I don't think an event like that would potentially sell out to the same level, because there is this desire to learn and talk about sex if you've been in positions where you haven't been able to before. And Masters and Johnson's research, and Alfred Kinsey as well, it's such a testament to that phenomenon.
Yeah, so true. Now, since we're on the subject of sex toys, let's talk about the history of the vibrator for a moment. Now, the idea of using vibration for sexual stimulation is not new. In fact, it may even predate electricity. And case in point, we pulled an old painting out of the Kinsey Institute archives depicting a woman using a tuning fork as a vibrator, which is a very unique vibratory mechanism. So there's a popular story out there about the vibrator having been invented by doctors who were treating women for hysteria. And the story basically says that orgasm was the cure, but it was taking too long for the doctors to get their female patients to orgasm by hand, so they developed the vibrator to help them be more efficient. Now, it turns out that this story isn't true, and that the first electric vibrator ever developed was actually made for men. So tell us about that.
It's such a fascinating story from history because we see where a misinformation can really take off like wildfire when we have this story that is kind of presented as quite sexy and cheeky of doctors' hands getting too sore from curing women of hysteria that they invent the vibrator. But on the other side of things, we have this story that very much puts women in particular in this place of completely lacking autonomy and being presented as incredibly ignorant. When in reality, the story of the vibrator, as you say, starts by being invented for men. So when the first vibrator was developed by Dr. Joseph Granville, the idea was to use this newfound technology of the vibrations for medical purposes as basically this cure-all device. He suggested that it could cure men's impotence, their blindness, their headaches, their stress pains, in some cases epilepsy. And the whole idea was that you would place the vibrator, which at the time basically looks like this machine that you don't want to go anywhere near. It looks like something from the Saw franchise that might kind of like punch you and vibrate at the same time. It's terrifying. And in all of his illustrations on how to use the product, he specifically uses it on a man's body. And the only thing close to a sexual use was to place it near a man's perineum, just underneath the testicles, to stimulate vibrations there, which would hopefully cure impotence. Where this kind of changes is as products around the 1950s start to be marketed towards women, particularly because women were seen as the homemakers, the people who would buy products in this kind of new age of commercial shopping. You had to advertise this product as something more for the whole family. And I think it is an interesting point to remember that at this time, having a vibrator, which was kind of seen as a massager and, as I say, a cure-all device, was as common in your household really as having a toaster. This was just kind of seen as a normal household product to have because no one was using it sexually. And it was advertised as something to buy for your grandma, your child, your husband as this perfect present to cure all of their headaches. And what I love is that when we start to see video advertising for the vibrator, there's this fantastic advert that was played on TV advertising a smart bed that, basically pops out, and a little tray and stove would pop out of the bed on one side, I suppose, if you want to cook in the middle of the night. But one thing, if you reach underneath and grab out, was your vibrator, which was just underneath the bed, all plugged in, ready to go. And they kind of do a bit of a wink to the camera, being like, look at Doris, she's got her vibrator to cure her headache. And there's this kind of tongue-in-cheek idea that, we're not totally ignorant. People, if we're placing this vibration all over the body, people have probably worked it out. But no one was talking about it until Betty Dodson comes around in the 1970s and starts to run her body sex workshops, where she basically just says, this household product that all of us have, this back massager, well, ladies, place it a little bit lower down. Let's talk about clitoral stimulation, which kind of does like a whole circle back round to the studies of Masters and Johnson, who, are proving that clitoral stimulation is most productive for women to have an orgasm. And while that conversation's going on, Betty Dodson's also there being like, that's great. Do you know what helps with that? Your back massager, which is really where our conversation about vibrator goes from a household medical device to something that is seen and associated solely with sexual pleasure, in particular women's.
So interesting. I love that story. And, vibrators for the whole family. Buy a vibrator for grandma.
I would love to see that go down now. To be fair, it might be great.
It might be. And also, it's interesting as you tell that story in terms of thinking about how other sexual health and wellness products were advertised over the years. So this has me thinking about a story that Hallie Lieberman told me when she was previously on the podcast about how butt plugs, or as they were called back in the day, rectal dilators, were actually marketed or advertised as a cure for asthma. And that they also had all of these miracle aspects to them and could cure any ills in your body.
Yes.
So it's just get a butt plug and a vibrator and all your problems are solved.
All your problems are solved. I think they were called, it's something like spectacular, like Dr. Young's spectacular rectal dilators, and they came in all different sizes. Oh, just wonderful. And they, because the headaches was also headaches always seems to be the issue. Headaches was one of the things that the butt plugs were meant to cure. But I do like it was a year's time that these were on the market that they had to be taken off because people were presenting too many injuries for leaving the butt plugs inside of them without taking time to remove them, which was causing a lot of trips to the doctors. So they had to be taken off the market within a year.
We need more butt plug education, apparently.
We do.
But, theoretically, I could see how butt plugs might help with a headache if they provide like a sense of distraction, right, from the pain. Like there's some argument you might be able to make there. But yeah, I don't know that butt plugs are going to cure all of your problems. But, certainly couldn't hurt to try. Just don't leave it in too long.
Couldn't hurt to try. Just make sure you've done your butt plug education first.
Yes, exactly. So we know today vibrators are enormously popular as sex toys for women, but let's talk a little bit more about this, right? So it's fascinating to me that the first vibrators were developed for men, but today when you look at vibrators in the marketplace, they're almost all geared toward women. And getting men to engage with the idea of a vibrator, either solo or during partnered activity, can be a challenge. Lots of guys are really resistant to this. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to why and how attitudes toward vibrators shifted so much over time to the point where guys are now very resistant to incorporating them into sexual activity. At least many guys are.
Absolutely. In our Australian national study that was done 4 years ago, I was surprised to see that it was 55% of men claimed that they'd used a vibrator. That was higher than I thought it was going to be. But then if you looked at the next question, which was, how have you used the vibrator? And it was solo play or partnered play. It was 98% I've used it on my partner. So men aren't using it on themselves, but may have encountered it. And I think this also has a very long-standing history, right? So when we go back to the 1600s, 1700s, where dildos in particular around Europe are being, I say mass-produced, but they're very readily available in the marketplace. And there's this kind of switch that happens around the time that Italy is the greatest purveyor of dildos, that dildos get linked with this sense of emasculation. And it's a very, very clear switch in literature from France and England at the time, where the dildo gets known as Signor Dildo. And people are Wilmot's writing poems saying all of the ladies of all of England are falling down at the Duchess's hand to see Signor Dildo. And there's a sense that all of the Englishmen are going to be robbed of their wives by the Italian lover that's superior. And this is the first time we kind of see this linking of emasculation, which also has, all of these geographical overtones as well. But I think when you take that from the 1700s and you look at where a lot of feelings about sex toys for men kind of still sit today quite dominantly. It's this sense of, well, why do I or my partner need a dildo when you've got me? And it's still this sense of kind of not understanding the role that sex toys can play in enhancing pleasure, fostering a kind of sense of autonomy with pleasure as well. And I think it comes down to this kind of lack of education or conversation that's been done for men in particular. Because as you say, when you go into a sex toy store, you're going to see a lot of dildos and vibrators that are specifically advertised to women or the gay community, you don't see a lot that actually include men. And in my time working selling sex toys, when men would come into the store, you're selling sex toys to try and explain how her use of sex toys can enhance your pleasure down the line. You know, there wasn't this sense of how can sex toys be used for you? Which I think is something that's starting to change because of access to social media and everything. In the most recent survey that Mum and I did, we're seeing a bigger uptake in men in particular experimenting with vibrators in particular for themselves, which is something I highly encourage because they are there to enhance pleasure and aid our sexual experience.
That they are. And I think, you're right. There's still a lot more that we have to do in terms of normalizing sex toys for men, because historically, like, a lot of guys have kind of seen this as a threat to them or to their sense of masculinity. And so, yeah, getting over that hump, to being able to engage with toys is going to require some sex education in many cases. Now, there are, of course, so many different kinds of sex toys out there, and we don't have time to dive into the history of each and every one. But I wanted to ask if there are any other toys that come to mind that you think have particularly interesting histories. Like, for example, when I was reading your book, I saw you talked about the history of cock rings and how in previous periods of time they were using like sheep or goat eyelids and eyelashes for this, which sounds really gross to me. Yeah.
That was the cock ring. I mean, here we go. We were talking about a sex toy or aid specifically designed for men. The cock ring was invented around the 13th century in China. And the original design was using the eyelids and eyelashes of goats. And how this would work they would essentially wet the cut off eyelid of the goat. They would tie it around the base of the member. And as it dried out, it would harden and, become tighter around the penis. And the eyelashes that were left on basically added for extra stimulation, and not only for the men, but also for the women that were, partaking in these activities. I mean, I shouldn't probably advertise it, but the goat eyelid is still around on black markets today. It's a really interesting example because when you're looking at the original design of the cock ring in particular, it was solely really for enhancing pleasure. Now there's this sense of, it can help enhance your ability to stay hard. And that was absolutely, there in the 13th century. But there was this idea of, just enhancing pleasure for both the man and the woman. When we eventually start making them in the 15th century out of jade, for instance, some of the designs, have a little dragon that goes all the way around the ring. And then the dragon has a little tongue that's poking out just to stimulate the woman's clitoris. And when you see designs of toys like this from hundreds of years ago, you also see this idea of how we've kind of, in our modern time, we think of the idea of like clitoral stimulation and everything about something that just suddenly gets invented in the 1960s. But it's not. We've had conversations and we've had toys that were working to enhance our bodily pleasure for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah, that's fascinating and disturbing all at the same time. In terms of the original cock ring, I never would have imagined that someone would have thought to develop a ring that way, but apparently they did.
I would like to know who was the first one to be like, do you know the eyelid?
Yeah.
Do you know what I could do with that?
I've thought about that before with many things. I'm like, who was the first person to, like, for example, look at that sea creature and be like, I should eat that. That looks tasty. Like, I don't know where people got these ideas in the first place.
That looks great. I would love them trying to sell that to their partner, being like, I know our pet donkey died. However, now hear me out, darling. Hear me out. How does that go down?
But I think you make an important point there that, a lot of the things in our modern world in terms of sexual health and wellness aids, I think we have a tendency to assume that these are modern inventions, new things, but they all have these long and fascinating histories behind them. And that also includes things like contraception as well. although the birth control pill has only been on the market since, the 1960s or so, people have been using various forms of contraception since, very ancient times. And, a lot of it in early times was based on superstition and other things like that. But, the idea of birth control is not new either. And, for example, they were using makeshift diaphragms and other things like that way back in the day, sometimes I believe made of crocodile excrement, which sounds, pretty gross as well. Not something I think many people would want to put in their body.
I mean, it's probably a great deterrent for sex, to be honest. That was in ancient Egypt.
Maybe that's how it worked.
I think so. Could you imagine the smell? Genuinely, that's... But that was something that they were doing in ancient Egypt, where they essentially created a kind of like suppository that was made out a combination of crocodile feces. Firstly, I loved that was so accessible, and honey kind of mixed together and then shoved inside a woman's hoo-ha. And yes, it's probably the smell that worked as the main deterrent. But it's also fascinating because at the same time in ancient Egypt, they were using the gum from the acacia tree as a spermicide. And this we know to be a very effective form of spermicide still today. So it's not like they were, they were always just doing willy-nilly ideas like crocodile feces. Sometimes these ideas did work. So I like looking back in history where you get to kind of separate the sublime from the ridiculous when it comes to these ideas.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad we have you to do this dive into history with and teach us all about what we didn't know about our kinky history. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Esme. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Absolutely. So my book, Kinky History, is now available worldwide, and you can find me across socials at esme.louise, wherever you get your social media content.
Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sexandpsychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.